Okay, Bismillah, let's start, yeah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه الغر الميامين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, it is a privilege for me to be here before all of you to discuss another great Islamic scholar. And before beginning our talk today on the biography of Al-Imam Ibn Al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the greatest scholars of Islam, I just wanted to briefly begin by discussing the importance of gatherings like this. You see, as we all know, learning about the biographies, learning about the siyar, learning about the lives of the prophets is of great importance. And after learning about the lives of the prophets, also learning about the lives of the scholars is very, very important. Scholars of Islam. Because when you learn about the lives of Islamic scholars, not only do you appreciate what such Islamic scholars offered in terms of knowledge, but you also see a practical effort, a practical implementation of how they implemented the knowledge that they gained, the knowledge that they had, and how you may also implement. You know, we learn from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that al-ulama warathatul anbiya, that the scholars, or kama qala alayhi salatu wassalam, that the scholars are the inheritors of the anbiya. The scholars are the inheritors of the anbiya. They are the ones that actually inherit from the prophets. And obviously when we speak about inheritance, we're speaking about knowledge, right? So this is the importance of actually covering biographies like this. Instead of hearing about names, random names, and knowing that this scholar was a knowledgeable scholar, you actually learn about his life so that you can extract and take away lessons from his life. So, as mentioned, today we are going to be covering a brief biography of Ibn Al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala. And when I say brief, obviously 45 minutes to an hour is brief. You must know that. Because there are many, many things. You could cover multiple podcasts. You could do a whole dawrah. You could hold days of lessons on the lives of such scholars. But we are just going to be covering, inshallah, perhaps a page from the life of this scholar, inshallah ta'ala. So firstly, let's discuss the political context that Ibn al-Qayyim was born in. Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah ta'ala, was born within the 7th century of Islam. So, within the 7th century Hijri. He was born in the year 691. And during this period, we have multiple threats from disbelievers and also those claiming to be Muslims, attempting to make efforts into Bilad al-Sham, into Mamluk territory. Muslims during this period were focused on dealing with the threat from the Franks, the Crusaders, and actually at the Battle of Marj al-Sufar, which is also referred to as Shuqhub, this is a battle that Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, he fought in. And this was in the year 1303. In the year 1303. And obviously not Hijri. We're talking about in the Gregorian calendar. This battle that Shaykh al-Islam fought in, during this time, Ibn al-Qayyim was 12 years old. And he hadn't yet started to study with Ibn Taymiyyah. So Ibn Taymiyyah was actually directly involved in fighting off the Tatars, the Mongols. As we know, there are 4 types of different Mongols, right? You have the Golden Horde, you have the Yuan dynasty, you had the Ilkhanids, okay? The Ilkhanid Mongols, Hulaku Khan and his descendants, they were making efforts to capture Bilad al-Sham. They wanted to capture Bilad al-Sham. Ibn Taymiyyah was one of those figures who was making a constant effort, whether it be through his role as a scholar, a propagandist, a diplomat, visiting Ghazan Khan, who was the leader at the time of the Mongols, the Ilkhanid Mongols, who was attributing himself to Islam. Ibn Taymiyyah made various efforts and even physically fought against these people. During this whole period, Ibn al-Qayyim had began studying, but he hadn't yet met Ibn Taymiyyah to study with him. He was 12 years old during the Battle of Marj al-Sufar. Okay? And he was living in Damascus, which also means that he would have first-hand witnessed the Tatar threat, the Mongol threat on the Muslims. And it also means that more likely than not, he was also aware of the activism of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. So even though he hadn't yet studied with him, he knew who he was. We can assume this, that he knew who he was, and perhaps even him knowing who Ibn Taymiyyah was caused that desire in him to actually go on to study with him in more later years. As for the context of knowledge, then as mentioned before, during this period, the Umara, the leaders, they knew the importance of Islamic scholarship. So there were many madaris, many schools of learning, okay? Darul Ashrafiyah, Al-Jawziyah, all of these different madaris that people were going and studying in, and scholarship was vast. And actually that's why, if you just name the scholars from this general period, you will continuously keep naming them. Imam al-Dhahabi, al-Nawawi, Ibn al-Qayyim, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Muflih, and the list goes on. Safiyuddin al-Hindi, so many names you can continue to name. Ibn Muflih, so many names you can name of serious scholars. Ibn al-Salah, so many names you can name, right? So this shows you, and by the way, all of these names we're mentioning, they were situated in the same area, around the area of Syria, Damascus. So it shows you the effort that was being made to produce scholars and thinkers. So Ibn al-Qayyim, this is the knowledge context that he grew up around, that he was raised in. Now, another thing that we must mention, obviously we haven't exactly started speaking about Ibn al-Qayyim's biography. These are just muqaddimat that we need to give, introductions that we need to give. A lot of the biographies of Ibn al-Qayyim are very small. Very small. And just to give you an example, Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, Ibn Kathir's Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, which is a voluminous work, multiple volumes, okay, more than 5 volumes, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 volumes, okay. This work, depending on obviously which print you have, this work is a voluminous work. The biography of Ibn al-Qayyim within this work is just 1 page. So if you look at some of the older biographies, we don't actually have extensive biographies of Ibn al-Qayyim. However, we have a lot of authorship from him. So through his own authorship, Zad al-Ma'ad, Tuhfat al-Mawdud, Al-Wabil al-Sayyib, through his different works that he authored, we are also able to create a picture of what Ibn al-Qayyim was up to, what he was doing. Specific moments where he speaks about himself. Ibn al-Qayyim's life, we can split it into 3. His life, we can split it into 3. So, first of all, he's born in the year 691. So the first stage of his life, we can say, was from birth to the year 712. So how old would he have been in 712? Around 22 years old, right? 22, 23 years old. This is 712 is when he met Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. When he began studying with Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn al-Qayyim was around 22 years old. Okay. And then you have the second period, which is 712 to 728. 728 is the year in which Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah passed away. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah passed away in the year 728. This is the second dawr. This is the second stage of Ibn al-Qayyim's life, you can say. So he spent around 16 years with his main teacher, Ibn Taymiyyah. 16 years. And then 728 till the passing of Ibn al-Qayyim. Till the passing of Ibn al-Qayyim. And we're going to mention how long after he lived. But these are just generally the 3 stages we can put. Now, there's actually a book by a Western academic. Her name is Katerina Bori. And anyone who's interested in Ibn Taymiyyah's work on an academic level, Western academia, they would have heard about this name. She's got various works on Ibn Taymiyyah. She has a book called The Scholar in the Shadow. Scholar in the Shadow. And it's a book about Ibn al-Qayyim. And one of the ideas that she puts across through her book is that Ibn al-Qayyim was a scholar in the shadow, meaning he was shadowed by Ibn Taymiyyah. Her essential thesis is that one of the main ideas of her book is if Ibn al-Qayyim lived in another period, when you look at the end result of Ibn al-Qayyim, who he became, the scholar that he became, and you look at the end result of Ibn Taymiyyah, her argument is as follows. If Ibn al-Qayyim lived, let's say, 100 years later, or 200 years later, he would be much, much more valued as a scholar than he already is. In a way, because he lived during the same period as his teacher, Ibn Taymiyyah, that actually, he was overshadowed by him. So in a way, it's like you having a specific football player, and then you have another football player. I'm just giving a random example, right? This second football player is actually an amazing world-class player, but because he's at the same time as this other one, he's overshadowed. So Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah ta'ala, because he's living at the same time as Ibn Taymiyyah, he became overshadowed by him. So even though, of course, we appreciate his scholarship, many people will find it difficult to give him, or won't give him, the true praise that he deserves because he's getting shadowed by Ibn Taymiyyah. Now obviously the argument goes that would he have been Ibn al-Qayyim the way we know him today if it wasn't for Ibn Taymiyyah? Would he have been the scholar that he became? Then obviously the answer would probably be no, he wouldn't be. But if we just compare them as end results, you look at Ibn al-Qayyim as an end result and you look at Ibn Taymiyyah as an end result, you see, subhanallah, that if he, as an end result, as a scholar, final scholar, with all of his books, etc., if he just lived in a different period, he would be way more valued than he actually was. Ibn al-Qayyim's name. Ibn al-Qayyim, his name, his kunya was Abu Abdullah. Abu Abdullah. During this period, many of the scholars had another title that they were called by. So for example, An-Nawawi was called Muhyiddin, right? Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah was called Taqiyuddin. Ibn al-Qayyim was called Shamsuddin. Shamsuddin. And his first name was Muhammad. Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr. Muhammad, the son of Abu Bakr, Ibn Ayyub, Ibn Sa'd, Ibn Harizin, Ibn Makki, Zayn al-Din al-Zur'i, al-Dimishqi al-Hanbali. So Ibn al-Qayyim, essentially, his name was Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr. That's how you can remember him. His first name and last name. Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr. Why is he called Ibn al-Qayyim? This is a question that arises. There is another scholar that many people get Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, or Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, I should say, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, confused with. Who is that scholar? Does anyone know? Ibn al-Jawzi, right? And it's clear to see why this confusion happens. You have Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, and then you have Ibn al-Jawzi. It's basically, essentially, we have the same word in both names. So what's happening here? Ibn al-Jawzi lived before Ibn al-Qayyim. And obviously they are different people. And actually even this, by the way, this confusion even resulted in certain people attributing books to, let's say, a book to Ibn al-Qayyim that should have been attributed to Ibn al-Jawzi. It actually resulted in this type of thing, right? Al-Jawziyah was a madrasa, a Hanbali madrasa. It was a Hanbali school of learning in Damascus. Al-Jawziyah. And this school of learning was established by Ibn al-Jawzi, who passed away in the year 656. When was Ibn al-Qayyim born? 691. So these two scholars didn't even meet. Ibn al-Jawzi and Ibn al-Qayyim, they did not meet. Okay? Now, Al-Jawziyah, this was a madrasa, as I mentioned. It was a school of learning. It was like your Cambridge University. Okay? It was a popular school of learning for Hanabila, for those who follow the Hanbali madhab. The reason why Ibn al-Qayyim is called Ibn al-Qayyim, or he's also referred to as Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, I'm going to speak about this in a second, okay, why we have these two names, okay, and the logic behind it. The reason why he's called this is because his father was Qayyim Al-Jawziyah. Qayyim Al-Jawziyah. His father, Abu Bakr ibn Ayyub, was Qayyim Al-Jawziyah. What is Qayyim Al-Jawziyah? It's a position. Al-Jawziyah is the madrasa. Qayyim is essentially the one who's in charge of Al-Jawziyah. Qayyim Al-Jawziyah literally means the man who's in charge of Al-Jawziyah. It's the highest position, one of the high positions you have. This person is in charge of Idaratul Madrasa. He's in charge of setting everything up. He has a high position in this madrasa. So his children and even his ancestors, or his descendants I should say, became named with this name. They were the children of Qayyim Al-Jawziyah. Now, in Arabic, you can say Ibn Al-Qayyim, the son of Al-Qayyim. Okay, with Alif Lam, the son of Al-Qayyim. In Arabic, you have two types of words. You can obviously categorize words in languages in different ways, right? One of the ways in which we categorize words, even in English, nouns, you have a definite noun and you have an indefinite noun, right? So what's an example of a definite noun? If I say, for example, the door, I'm speaking about a specific door. If I just say door, this is indefinite. You don't know which door I'm speaking about. I'm just speaking about a door. So in the Arabic language, you have the same thing. You have bab, which would just mean door. Babun, door. Okay? And then you have al-bab, the door. This is definite. I'm speaking about specific door. If you said Ibn Qayyim, his name is Ibn Qayyim, it doesn't make sense in Arabic. It's like saying son of footballer. Okay? What are you talking about? Son of Qayyim. Son of the one who was in charge of, son of the one who's in charge. In charge of what exactly, right? But if you say Ibn al-Qayyim, son of the one who was in charge, this is ma'rifah. You have ma'rifah and nakira in the Arabic language. Ma'rifah is something definite, nakira is indefinite, okay? So if you say Ibn al-Qayyim and you stop, it makes sense. Ibn al-Qayyim, because you have made the word Qayyim definite by putting alif lam. Okay, al-Qayyim. Or you can say Ibn Qayyim Al-Jawziyah. When you say Ibn Qayyim Al-Jawziyah, you're saying the son of the one who was in charge of Al-Jawziyah. But you can't say Ibn Al-Qayyim Al-Jawziyah. That doesn't make sense, because you've made both of them definite and it doesn't work. Okay? If this made sense to you, it made sense to you. If it didn't, this isn't an Arabic lesson. We'll move on, inshallah. But the correct way to say both names is as simple. Just to put it simply, you can say Ibn al-Qayyim or Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. Both. Many people make this mistake. Okay? So you can say one of the other. And this was a prolific madrasa. So going back to his biography, this is a madrasa in which he was raised. His father was in charge of this madrasa. It shows you the kind of household he came from. A scholarly household. His father is in charge of one of the main schools of the Hanabila in Bilad al-Sham. Okay? So his father was also praised by scholars. Like Ibn Kathir, for example, the famous Mufassir Ibn Kathir, he mentioned about Ibn al-Qayyim's father, كان رجلا صالحا متعبدا. That Ibn al-Qayyim's father, Sheikh Abu Bakr ibn Ayyub, he was a righteous man. He was a worshipper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was a diligent worshipper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was righteous. And Ibn Kathir, he mentions how others praised Ibn al-Qayyim's father. That he was a great man, he was a good man. His brother, Ibn al-Qayyim's brother, his name was Zayn ad-Din. He was also mentioned by the great scholar Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali as one of his teachers. So Ibn al-Qayyim's brother, Zayn ad-Din. Ibn al-Qayyim's son, he had a son called Abdullah. He was also a person of knowledge, person engulfed in knowledge. He taught, he debated, had an exceptional mind, a great thinker. And one of the things that shows you how he was, whoever's memorized Surah Al-A'raf, how many pages is it approximately? How many? Approximately 26, over 20 pages. It's over a juz. He memorized Surah Al-A'raf in 2 days. This son of Ibn al-Qayyim. So you can see he had a sharp mind, mashallah. Okay. Now when we come to Ibn al-Qayyim's studies, as mentioned, he was raised by his father, Qayyim al-Jawziyah. So that shows you where some of his studies would have come from. And actually, we don't have a detailed account of Ibn al-Qayyim's, how he studied in an ordered fashion. He done this, and then he done that, and then he done this. We don't have that. But we have enough information to know that he started studying very early on. Very, very early on. Okay? And we also have evidence from the works of Ibn al-Qayyim that showed he traveled to seek knowledge to different places. Al-Quds, to Egypt, Mecca, Tripoli in Libya. Okay? Various places. So for example, we have one of his books called At-Tuhfa al-Makkiyah. At-Tuhfa al-Makkiyah. Okay? Another book he has, Al-Risala al-Tabukiyah, which he authored in Tabuk, which is in modern day where? Saudi Arabia, right? North of Saudi Arabia, right? And he authored that in the year 733, which was after Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah passed away. So, now going back to it, Ibn Taymiyyah, going back to his teacher now, one of his main teachers, Ibn Taymiyyah was in Egypt for a specific period in his life for around 7 years. He was in Egypt. Then he returned back to Damascus. Okay? So when Ibn Taymiyyah would have left for Egypt, Ibn al-Qayyim was 15 years old. 15 years old. He was a teenager. When Ibn Taymiyyah returned back to Damascus, Ibn al-Qayyim was now 22 years old. And we have to bear in mind, Ibn al-Qayyim was now not just a student that doesn't have anything. Actually, he had reached a level in knowledge where he was, you could say, at a great level in knowledge, a good level in knowledge. That he was ready to study with someone like Ibn Taymiyyah and take things to the next level. And actually, one of the things that's mentioned after the passing of Shaykh al-Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah, it's mentioned that Ibn al-Qayyim didn't actually study with anyone else. By this stage, he was a seasoned scholar, par excellence. He didn't need to study with other people. He was already built as a scholar. And he would have been, by this point, engulfed in his authorship and other things. So, other scholars that Ibn al-Qayyim also studied with, other than his father and Ibn Taymiyyah, another scholar that's mentioned is Ash-Shihab al-Abir. And al-Abir, this name comes from because this scholar, Ash-Shihab al-Abir, was known to interpret dreams. He was known to interpret dreams. And what's really, really interesting, and what shows you the mind of Ibn al-Qayyim and how early he was studying from, is Ibn al-Qayyim in one of his works actually mentions about Shihab al-Abir that I wasn't actually able to take all of the knowledge from him. I wasn't able to benefit from him in the way I could have when I was older because I was 6 years old. I was 6 years old. So al-Abir, he had this knowledge of interpretation of dreams. Ibn al-Qayyim mentions I wasn't able to take that skill from him because I was young in age. And Shihab al-Abir then passed away. So this is something very, very interesting. Also, another person that Ibn al-Qayyim studied with was a scholar called Sharaf ad-Din ibn Taymiyyah. Who is this? It wasn't the grandfather. It wasn't al-Majd. It wasn't his grandfather. It was someone else. You can guess. His brother. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah's brother, Sharaf ad-Din ibn Taymiyyah, his name was Abdullah ibn Abdul Halim. He was Ibn Taymiyyah's brother. Okay, Ibn al-Qayyim also studied with him. And another one of Ibn al-Qayyim's teachers was Safiuddin al-Hindi, who was actually born in India. He was born in India in the year 644. Safiuddin al-Hindi. So Ibn al-Qayyim also studied with this teacher. And he has various other teachers as well. His students will mention his sons, Abdullah, who I already mentioned, Ibrahim, his son, and some biographies or some scholars will mention that Ibn Kathir, the Mufassir, was a student of Ibn al-Qayyim. However, something that should be noted when discussing the case of Ibn Kathir, and this happened with various scholars. Like for example, this is a discussion that scholars will have about Al-Dhahabi in relation to Ibn Taymiyyah. That they'll mention, for example, Al-Dhahabi studied with Ibn Taymiyyah, but he was also a peer of Ibn Taymiyyah. He could also be considered as a peer of Ibn Taymiyyah. Whereas you have some scholars who it's clear, no, he was a student of him. And they weren't on the same level in that way. But Ibn Kathir, it seems like he was also a peer of Ibn al-Qayyim, because within his own work, when, for example, Ibn Kathir speaks about Ibn al-Qayyim in Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, he says, Sahibuna. He refers to him as our companion. And that's not the ada. Usually especially with these scholars, if you studied with someone, like Ibn al-Qayyim, he studied with Ibn Taymiyyah, it was clear cut, he was his teacher, he always refers to him in his work as Shaykhuna, our Shaykh. Okay, so some scholars have something to say about that. Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, who's very, very famous, Hanbali madhab, very, very famous, illustrious scholar from amongst the Hanbalis. He has the best sharh on Al-Arba'un, Jami' al-Ulum al-Hikam, and other works as well, of course. Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali was one of Ibn al-Qayyim's students. He was one of Ibn al-Qayyim's students. Now, when we speak about Ibn al-Qayyim's relationship with Ibn Taymiyyah, and we would have already noticed by now, you can't speak about Ibn al-Qayyim without speaking about Ibn Taymiyyah. You can't, you're going to continuously keep mentioning. And that is because there is no doubt about the fact that even though Ibn al-Qayyim, as I will try to express, he had his own personality, he had his own character, there was a level of effect that Ibn Taymiyyah had in the life of Ibn al-Qayyim that cannot be removed from Ibn al-Qayyim. In fact, Ibn al-Qayyim, he has a famous poem called An-Nuniyah. And in An-Nuniyah, he brings a few lines discussing about how he used to have specific beliefs in Aqidah that he actually repented from at the hands of Ibn Taymiyyah. Meaning Ibn Taymiyyah actually aided Ibn al-Qayyim in changing his views. And he's expressing how grateful he is, and he's showing how grateful he is to his teacher Ibn Taymiyyah by even mentioning this in this poem. What Ibn Taymiyyah done for him as a teacher. So it wasn't just one or two things. It was, you can see the clear effect in his work and in other than that as well. Now, there is a question that arises, which is, was Ibn al-Qayyim a carbon copy of Ibn Taymiyyah? Was he a carbon copy of Ibn Taymiyyah? Does anyone have anything to say about this? I'll ask the people, based on anything you may know. What do you guys think? Any opinions?
Maybe Ibn al-Qayyim was more organized in arguments.
Okay. This is a very interesting perspective. So the brother mentioned, for those who can't hear, that Ibn al-Qayyim, perhaps he was more organized in his way of arguing for specific points. It's a very interesting point. Any other comments anyone has? Based on anything you may know? Okay, so look, it depends what you mean. It depends what you mean, right? If you're going to say that was Ibn al-Qayyim the type of scholar, the type of student that just went with every single view that his teacher gave him, he had no critical thinking, there was no time where he disagreed with his teacher, and he was literally just, his job and mission was to just pass on what Ibn Taymiyyah left behind. No, that's not the case, and that's not accurate. That's not accurate. Because Ibn al-Qayyim, there were issues, even though they may be little. Ibn al-Qayyim had his own opinion. And there are specific views, actually, that Ibn al-Qayyim may have held that he disagreed with Ibn Taymiyyah on. In fact, there's one issue, for example, which is mentioned how he tried to convince Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah of his own view, and Ibn Taymiyyah wasn't budging. Right? So it shows you Ibn al-Qayyim as a scholar, he had his own way of thinking. Not only this, as the brother rightly mentioned, if you look at on an authorship level, if you look at the authorship of Ibn Taymiyyah, and this is something that Sheikh Bakr Abu Zayd mentions and expresses, if you look at the authorship of Ibn Taymiyyah and you compare the authorship of Ibn Taymiyyah with Ibn al-Qayyim, you notice a clear-cut difference. First of all, in topics, yes, on some occasions they will speak about the same topics, but for example, the way in which Ibn al-Qayyim will speak about that topic will be different from Ibn Taymiyyah. The way in which he'll formulate that topic will be different than Ibn Taymiyyah. And actually, for example, one of the things that will be mentioned is Ibn al-Qayyim has a specific way that some people may generally prefer, in terms of, okay, this is a much more, let's say, nicer way. Not that Ibn Taymiyyah didn't know how to write or anything like that, but Ibn al-Qayyim, the way in which he writes, the way in which he's expressing his points, is in a very, very specific, beautiful way that, let's say, Ibn Taymiyyah didn't do it in that specific way. So there's a difference on that level. Not only that, there are specific issues that Ibn al-Qayyim goes into. Like, for example, the way in which Ibn al-Qayyim deals with the issue of qadr, which even when we were doing Arba'un, it's a topic that we came across, right? And it's a big topic. Those who have knowledge of the Islamic library, when I say the Islamic library, all of the book, many of the books, the main books that have been authored in our Islamic tradition, they will tell you that there is not a book like Shifa'ul Alil of Ibn al-Qayyim that deals with Mas'alatul Qadr, the issue of Qadr. There's no book that exists that has been authored like Ibn al-Qayyim's book. Not even by Ibn Taymiyyah. The way in which Ibn al-Qayyim dealt with it. So Ibn al-Qayyim, from one sense, of course, you can't separate that effect of his teacher. But from another sense, it would be injustice to Ibn al-Qayyim to look at him as, yeah, you're basically just you're basically just like the like the B-Tech version of Ibn Taymiyyah. No, it's not like that. As you know, some of them will say. Huh? Hopefully has anyone done a B-Tech here? We're in Cambridge, respectable place. Huh? So this is the point here, that Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, there were differences between them in that sense. Zadul Ma'ad, there are certain books that Ibn al-Qayyim authored that just make him stand out as a scholar. Him, Zadul Ma'ad, Miftahu Dar al-Sa'ada, specific authorship, specific mabahith, even specific issues that he deals with. And subhanAllah, even with Shaykh Abdullah, I remember once we covered a section from Ibn al-Qayyim's sharh of Sunan Abi Dawood, and how Ibn al-Qayyim deals with the issue of, does hijama break the fast of the fasting person? And the way in which Ibn al-Qayyim formulates his argument, and he corrects Imam al-Shafi'i on a specific issue. I know Imam al-Shafi'i, this is built on assuming that Anas bin Malik was for this day and that day, and you have to, shows you that this guy he's a genius, absolute genius. And that's why actually some of those who done his biography referred to him as Mujtahid Mutlaq, Ibn al-Qayyim, that he was the highest level of Islamic scholar you can possibly have. Like we would refer to Imam al-Shafi'i, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Ahmed, as they were mujtahid mutlaq. And scholars will say Ibn al-Qayyim mujtahid mutlaq. That doesn't mean he's on the same level as, let's say, Ahmed or Shafi'i, etc. But it shows you he crosses a threshold that in the way in which scholars are speaking about him. So that's a very, very important point to bear in mind. He had his own personality. His works are evidence of this. So Ibn al-Qayyim lived 23 years after Ibn Taymiyyah, which means that he died in what year? What year did Ibn Taymiyyah die in? 728, right? So Ibn al-Qayyim died 23 years later, which is? '51. 751. Interestingly also, one of the things that many people may not know about Ibn al-Qayyim is that he actually went through, even after Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, he passed away in prison. And when Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah passed away in prison, where was Ibn al-Qayyim? He was also in prison. Ibn al-Qayyim was also in prison. And Ibn al-Qayyim was in prison multiple times in his life. And these multiple times also reflect similar reasons as to why Ibn Taymiyyah was imprisoned as well. So Ibn al-Qayyim was also placed in prison multiple times during his life for similar reasons to Ibn Taymiyyah. So even after the passing of his teacher, he was in a constant state of struggle in that way. With regards to teaching, biographies of Ibn al-Qayyim mention how He was involved in teaching, fatawa, imama, authorship. Ibn Kathir actually describes him as Imam Al-Jawziyah. Imam Al-Jawziyah. He was the Imam of Al-Jawziyah. And he also taught in a madrasa called Al-Sadriyah. And as I mentioned to you guys, that he passed away in the year 751. And Ibn Kathir mentions about how his janazah was hafila. It was full. People, many people came for his janazah. And there are a few topics that we need to speak about. A few topics that we need to speak about relating to the scholar's biography before we end, inshallah ta'ala. Number one, his mannerisms. Obviously, this is the tabi'ah with any human being. The way in which you're raised, the surroundings that you are raised in, they affect the way in which you behave. They affect your mannerisms. They affect the way you are with people. And Ibn Kathir, he actually described the mannerisms of Ibn al-Qayyim in the following way. He mentions he had beautiful recitation and good mannerisms. He was very affectionate. He was not jealous of anyone. Look at the specific things that Ibn Kathir is choosing to mention. That Ibn al-Qayyim wasn't the type of person that would be jealous of anyone. He wasn't jealous of anyone, subhanallah. And he didn't harm anyone. He's not the type of person that would harm anyone. And he did not seek out flaws in people. Look at these specific characteristics that we should all strive towards. He didn't seek out flaws in people. And he didn't feel resentment towards anyone. Now the question is, how on earth does Ibn Kathir know these things that are يعني من أمور القلب? This is to do with the issues of the heart. It's because of clearly knowing Ibn al-Qayyim, being with Ibn al-Qayyim, and seeing the way in which he would behave with other people. How he was with other people. Not only that, his worship. His worship, my dear brothers, one of the things that we have to emphasize when we speak about worship. Ibn al-Qayyim had a very, very unique position that maybe you won't hear by many people about, takhfif al-salah, making salah light for people. For example, one of the positions, like from Ibn al-Qayyim's perspective, it is min takhfif al-salah, making the salah light, to read surah to Ali Imran in Salatul Maghrib. That is making salah light. Why? Because his logic was, how do we look at the lightness of salah? We look at the salah of the Prophet ﷺ. And when we look at the salah of the Prophet ﷺ, we see specific, let's say, athar, narrations discussing the way in which the Prophet ﷺ would pray his salah. And Ibn al-Qayyim now, it's one thing having that view on a theological level. Like for example, scholars, mashayikh, students of knowledge will tell you a theological position, but you don't see it from them. Ibn al-Qayyim, look at what Ibn Kathir mentions. He mentions about Ibn al-Qayyim, I do not know of anyone in this world. He says, I do not know of anyone in this world in our time who is engaged in more ibadah than him, than Ibn al-Qayyim. And he had a way in salah, and this is very famous. This statement about him is very famous. He had a tariqah fi salah. He had a way in salah that he would lengthen it very much. His salah would be long. Ibn al-Qayyim's salah was a long salah. He would lengthen the ruku'. He would lengthen the sujood. And sometimes to the extent, some of his companions would blame him for this. They would blame him for this. You're making it too long. Right? You're making your salah, it is too long. Okay? And he would not change this, he would not leave this. Look at the way in which Ibn Kathir is describing the ibadah of this Imam. Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, his student, he noted how when he was imprisoned, Ibn al-Qayyim, he was kind of mashghulan bil-Quran. He was busy with the recitation of the Quran. Pondering over it, tadabbur, thinking, that's what he was doing. That's what he was doing. And even on a side benefit, nowadays, for example, on social media, yesterday I was in a specific ISOC in Birmingham, and one of the brothers asked me a question about Ahlul Quran. Do you think it's important to have suhbah, to accompany Ahlul Quran, the people of the Quran? I said to him, nowadays, many of the people have a very, very specific view of what Ahlul Quran means. For many people, to be from Ahlul Quran, you just have to be a qari who can recite the Quran nicely, and he's from Ahlul Quran. We should spend time with this guy. And many people, the second thing which makes a person from Ahlul Quran, which is implementing that which you are reading, many people neglect this thing. Many people neglect this thing. So just because a guy recites the Quran nicely, he has a عنده تلاوة جميلة, خلاص هو من أهل القرآن. Anyone can have a nice recitation of the Quran. Children have nice recitations of the Quran. Does that necessarily mean you are from Ahlul Quran? This is a big thing. It's a big title. But when you look at these scholars, they were people of implementation. They were people that were imprisoned because they went through serious tests. And not only that, within their tests, because of their knowledge, they implemented the Quran. One of the amazing things that's even mentioned about Ibn Taymiyyah was a bahr. He wrote in various topics. When you study Usul al-Tafsir, you study Ibn Taymiyyah. When you study Aqidah, you study Ibn Taymiyyah. When you study Fiqh, you'll study Ibn Taymiyyah. When you study Seerah, you can go into the views of Ibn Taymiyyah. When you study Qira'at, Ibn Taymiyyah will have positions to do with, let's say, Qira'at, and so every field. But what's one of the things that Ibn Taymiyyah expressed? I wish that I had more time with the Quran. I wish that I focused more on the Quran. He was a Hafiz of the Quran. And he implemented the Quran. For example, just to give an example of Ibn Taymiyyah, the teacher of Ibn al-Qayyim, Ibn Taymiyyah, when during one of the battles against the Tatars, he was telling the people, don't worry guys, we're winning this. We've got this. So some of the Umara, they said to him, Qul insha'Allah. You know how people say nowadays, today as well, they'll say insha'Allah, brother. You're speaking with a lot of confidence, say insha'Allah. He said, insha'Allah tahqiqan, la ta'liqan. He said, I'm saying insha'Allah, I know it's going to happen. I'm not saying it the way in which we say insha'Allah, as a comment. No, insha'Allah, and I know it's going to happen. So someone will say, okay, you are Shaykh al-Islam, you are a great scholar of Islam. Even him expressing subhanallah, it's in Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz that we're going to win. Where did you get that from? Who told you it's in Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz that we're going to win? Right? And his logic was the Quran. He would use ayats from the Quran. Ayats from the Quran showing this situation that we are in, this ayah applies to it. And Allah mentions, لَيَنْصُرَنَّهُ اللَّهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will indeed aid that person, give that person victory, will indeed aid that person. So he would say, no, I believe in the Quran, it's going to happen. And it happened. That's how he was. So that is what a person of the Quran is. A person who understands what he's reading, what he's pondering upon. So Ibn al-Qayyim was in the same manner. His own student is mentioning he was busy with the Quran in his time in prison, not just wasting his time. And subhanAllah, one of the things that this reminds us of is, may Allah protect us all from this type of situation. Those of you who've ever been locked up in a cell, not going to ask why or anything, but those of you who've ever been locked up in a cell or anything like that, you know how it is. It's not a good situation. It's not a nice situation to be in, even for one night. And one of the things that should come to a person's mind is, if I was ever put in that situation, what would I do? Many of us, our minds are empty, so we wouldn't have anything to do. These scholars had memorized the Quran. They were locked in the cell, repeated the Quran. Like even about Ibn Taymiyyah, it's mentioned, repeated the Quran 83 times in prison. 83 times in prison. How did he do that? He had memorized the Quran. He knew the Quran very well. So you think about yourself, that if I'm ever in a situation where I'm busy or I'm alone or I don't have anything to do, I should be keeping myself busy with the Quran. Another thing is that is mentioned about Ibn al-Qayyim that shows his knowledge. And we're coming towards the end of this brief biography. Another thing that shows his knowledge is Sheikh Bakr Abu Zayd, one of the scholars that we have, recent scholars. He actually went through the works of Ibn al-Qayyim. And what was one of the purposes that he went through the works of Ibn al-Qayyim for? To see how many books does Ibn al-Qayyim refer to within his works. How many books does he refer to within his works? That shows that he had ittila' on these kutub. He had read these books. He had gone through these books. How many works do we have? And he counted 569 books that Ibn al-Qayyim would have read, gone back to, read these, returned to these books. It shows you how Ibn al-Qayyim, how wasi' his ittila' was on these books, how wide scoped his access to knowledge was. And not only that, actually, one of the things that's mentioned about Ibn al-Qayyim on a personal level, as a collector of books, he was known during his time, not now we refer to him, he was known during his time as someone who had an amazing large collection of books. To the extent, it's mentioned, after he passed away, rahimahullah, his family members, it took them so long, for so long, they were selling his books. His books were not running out. He had so many books. Large collection of books. There are a couple of stories that we have from Ibn al-Qayyim to do with his teachers. And I would like to end with a couple of those, inshallah ta'ala. But before we do, one thing that I do want to mention as well that you see about Ibn al-Qayyim is that Ibn al-Qayyim, for example, he was someone, just like Ibn Taymiyyah's teacher Ibn Taymiyyah, when they were asked a specific question, they gave more than what you asked. And this is something we see from the Prophet ﷺ as well. The Prophet ﷺ is asked a question and he gives the questioner more than what the questioner asked for. In the same way, Ibn Taymiyyah is asked for a fatwa, he gives the questioner more than what he's asked for. Ibn al-Qayyim, for example, there's a specific book Ibn al-Qayyim has on Hukm al-Sama'. One of the publishers of this book, of Ibn al-Qayyim, to show you how Ibn al-Qayyim was a scholar, one of the really clever things that they done is, they added towards the end of this book, they added a number of answers to the same question that other scholars gave. And those answers were 1 page, let's say half a page, couple of pages. And then they showed you Ibn al-Qayyim, what was his answer? His answer was a whole book. Another example is Ad-Da'u wad-Dawa. Ad-Da'u wad-Dawa, one of Ibn al-Qayyim's most famous books, people don't know, it's an answer to a question. And if you read the beginning, the first couple of pages of the book, you will find Ibn al-Qayyim was asked a question, and we covered this when we covered that section from Ad-Da'u wad-Dawa on the effects of sins. Ibn al-Qayyim was asked a question regarding someone who is kind of drowning in sin and he's struggling with a specific sin, and he doesn't specifically mention that sin, and the question is half a page. Ibn al-Qayyim gave him a whole book. Ibn al-Qayyim gave him a whole book. So he was generous with his knowledge. One of the stories that's mentioned about Ibn al-Qayyim with Ibn Taymiyyah is Ibn al-Qayyim himself mentions how he would go to Ibn Taymiyyah, his sheikh. He would go to him and he would time after time go to him with specific shubuhat, specific doubts that he's come across. How do you answer this doubt? How do you answer that doubt? How do you answer this doubt? Etc. So Ibn Taymiyyah responded to him and said, لا تجعل قلبك كالإسفنجة. Do not make your heart, Ibn al-Qayyim, like al-isfinja, like a sponge, that any doubt it hears, it just soaks it up. And what happens with a sponge that just soaks up doubts? When you squeeze it, what will come out? Those doubts that it has soaked up. So Ibn Taymiyyah is telling Ibn al-Qayyim, don't make your heart like a sponge that it just soaks up everything it hears. Rather, you should make your heart like a zujaja. What is a zujaja? Like a glass, right? You can identify it, you can identify things, pour them out. Identify things, pour them out. A glass doesn't just absorb everything. It has the ability to pour things out. So this is one of the things that we learn. Not only this, for example, you have a famous example of an issue called Al-Batus. Al-Batus. Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, when he discusses the issue of Al-Batus, there's a question, a specific question that's asked. which is, if I'm, and this is something that appeals to all of us, if I'm someone who's drowning in sin, and this is something that people deal with now, I'm someone who's drowning in sin. One of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on getting rid of these sins before doing X, Y, and Z acts of worship. Before doing X, Y, and Z acts of worship, I'm going to focus on getting rid of these sins. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, his answer to this is that, you have something called al-batus. What is al-batus in the Arabic language? It's jubbul qadar. It's like a hole full of filth and rubbish. It's a hole of filth. Literally just full of filth. If you are like a hole of filth, if you are like a hole, if you have all of this filth inside you, what do you do? Ibn Taymiyyah's advice is, you must do excessive amounts of ibadah. You do ibadah, ibadah, ibadah. So it's like filling that hole of filth with water. And the water's going in, water's going in, water's going in. Eventually even that filth will come out. As opposed to focusing on taking out every single drop of that filth one by one with your hands, it's going to be a very, very difficult task. So he uses this example. This example. In summary, the legacy of Ibn al-Qayyim. The legacy of Ibn al-Qayyim now. We have many books from Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala. And unfortunately, one of the things that has happened with his books is many people neglect his books actually. And he was a scholar who had, one of the things that you see in his character, for example, one of his sons, when his son had a child, when Ibn al-Qayyim's son had a child, one of his children had a child. So he's now got a grandson. Ibn al-Qayyim, he didn't have enough wealth to give his son a gift for the child. So what does he do? He authors a book. The book is called Tuhfatul Mawdud bi Ahkam al-Mawlud. He authors a book called A Gift for the One Who is Beloved, discussing the rulings to do with the one who was born. So he gives his son a book that we have, by the way, okay. It's a small book, okay, where he discusses all different types of issues to do with having a child. Different types of ahkam, rulings to do with having a child. So he's got many beautiful books that a person can read, that people have benefited from, okay, that are absolutely beautiful, and his authorship is beautiful. Even in the English language, you have some small books that have been translated, like one of the ones I remember I read when I was just beginning of reading books, Patience and Gratitude, Ibn al-Qayyim. It's a section taken from one of his works. And the amount of amazing ideas that you get from this great scholar. So the point is, this was a brief treatment of this scholar's life. However, one of the things that all of us is incumbent upon us to do is to go back, research further about them. Some of these scholars, subhanAllah, we don't even know their names. We know them, Ibn al-Qayyim. Okay, know his name, know how he was, know some of the tests that he went through, so you can also internalize some of those things and actually benefit from those things and see the legacy and the sadaqah jariyah these people left behind. The last point that I'm going to mention is on this point of sadaqah jariyah. SubhanAllah, even though that we live in a time where it is so easy to leave things behind and for people to benefit from those things, because of social media, because of YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, we live in a time where it is easy for you to build a project and leave something behind for others to benefit from. My dear brothers and sisters, when we look at Ibn al-Qayyim, Ibn Taymiyyah, all of these different scholars, Ibn Rajab, Ibn Kathir, they did not live at a time like that. They lived at a time where you don't have printing press, you don't have social media, you don't have marketing, you don't have any of this. Yet subhanallah, perhaps because of their sincerity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitated for these great scholars their works to be left behind in clear form for us to be able to read and benefit from. And Ibn al-Qayyim could never have imagined that we would be sitting in a masjid in a non-Muslim country, from those people that they were a country that at that time, the Franks and the Crusaders, You know, the places that they were coming from, places like this, to fight them. We would be sitting here explaining his life. They could never imagine. But this is the nature of barakah. Imagine you in 700 years, 800 years, someone doing your biography. That would be something unbelievable, subhanAllah. And Ibn al-Qayyim, once again, bearing in mind, no social media, no nothing like this. And the way in which, this is the last point. I know I've mentioned that a few times now, but this is the last point I'm going to mention. The way in which these books are put together, many people don't know. You know, in Arabic books, you have something called a process of tahqiq al-kutub. You have a muhaqqiq. His job literally, when you look at some of these books, and you look at, let's say, some of the books of Ibn al-Qayyim, they have to tell you, how do we know this is a book of Ibn al-Qayyim? Nisbatul kitab ila al-mu'allif. How do we know it's a book of Ibn al-Qayyim? So they will tell you, for example, and for many of these books, where's the manuscript of this book? In Paris, in Leiden, in Yale. This is where the manuscript is of this book. This is where the manuscript is of this book. And scholars will come, their job is, modern day scholars, they will read that manuscript. How do we know? Because such and such scholar wrote that book. Like you have copies of books. This book we know, it's mentioned, written on this book, it was read upon the author. And then, let's say, for some of these books you have one nuskha. You literally have one manuscript. And a scholar comes, this one manuscript they found in a random place. He takes that manuscript, he reads it, takes the laptop, copies it over, and then it becomes published for you to buy in a bookshop that you can put on your library. When you understand that this book went through a process like that, just for you to read it, that also shows you something great. So this is something, all of these things that we need to bear in mind, inshallah ta'ala. And one thing that I will mention, Sheikh Abdullah, who's going to have his session next, inshallah, he is someone who you can really benefit from if you understand the Arabic language. There are a couple of podcasts that he's done. There's one called Al-Imaman, which I benefited from even for this talk, where he discusses the relationship between Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. And he's got one on Ibn al-Qayyim by himself as well on the podcast app. You can listen to it. And Sheikh Abdullah, one of the reasons why he is someone to go to, actually, one of the best people to go to in the world for this, is because every single word Ibn al-Qayyim has written that we have access to, all of Ibn al-Qayyim's books, he has read them. He's read every single book of Ibn al-Qayyim. Every single one. And of Ibn Taymiyyah. So in reality, he should have been doing this. But inshallah next time. Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullahu khairan, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.